It was murder most foul on a Friday afternoon. A former parliamentary colleague of mine, Sir David Amess MP, stabbed allegedly 17 times in his constituency surgery. There are many, many aspects to this affair that need the deepest consideration, not all of which can yet be done, not least for reasons of time. But my guest today is, like me, a former parliamentary colleague of David Amess. He is the former Conservative minister and twice Conservative candidate for Mayor of London, Steven Norris, and I'm glad to say he joins me now. Steve, it does shake one a bit that when one knew someone so well, sat for so many decades in Parliament with them, meets such a grisly end. What was your feeling when you heard the news?
I actually went into Parliament on the same day as David in 1983 and actually shared an office with him in that first Parliament. He was the loveliest guy imaginable, and that's why, like you, I was just shocked and horrified when I heard what had happened, clung to the hope that he might survive, and saw that hope dashed far too shortly thereafter. It really was the most awful thing, because you can't think of anybody who's simply a nicer, more dedicated constituency MP than David Amess. He never wanted to be a minister. He always simply enjoyed looking after the people that he represented, whether it was in Basildon. Of course, famously, he was the bellwether that night in 1992 that signalled that perhaps Neil Kinnock's celebrations were a little bit premature. But then for Southend, city that he obviously, a town that he obviously loved and wanted to be a city, but where he represented not just the constituents, regardless of their parliamentary affiliations, but, so many other decent causes to do with, with illness, with deprivation, with injustice. If you had to construct your ideal member of Parliament of any party, you'd go for somebody like David Amess. Dreadful, dreadful outcome.
Now, this isn't the first, of course. 5 years ago, Jo Cox murdered outside her constituency. Stephen Timms, a former minister, multiply stabbed in his constituency surgery. Nigel Jones, attacked with a samurai sword. His office manager murdered, defending him. We haven't learned very much from these things. I sat, as you did, for more years than I care to remember, with only a little desk separating me from who knew whom, with nothing to defend me more than my pencil. It is a rather British amateurism, isn't it?
Well, I think it's actually fundamental to the relationship between a member of Parliament and the people that member of Parliament represents. Whether it's a good development or not, there's more and more focus these days on the local member of Parliament as a sort of surrogate social worker. Long gone, my predecessor, Sir John Biggs-Davison, long passed away, visited the seat about 4 times a year. Had to be reminded of the names of most of the senior personnel in the party machine. But he didn't see it as necessary to bother himself too much with issues which perhaps were more appropriately those for a local authority or local health authority, whatever. These days, that simply can't pass. Members are expected to be very, very much almost the first port of call for constituents with problems. And so, yes, you could call it amateurish. I think it's deeply embedded in our belief in what a member of Parliament's responsibilities are. The big issue.
Yet, there's a very peculiar direction now being taken by the commentariat. The alleged murderer is allegedly an Islamist extremist of one kind or another. We'll learn more about that. But most of the commentary is now about using this dreadful event to further crack down on freedom of speech. We're being told we mustn't criticize the motives of politicians and so on. Well, I spent my life questioning the motives of politicians, and I intend to continue doing so. Are you, like me, a little disconcerted by this turn?
Yeah, very much. I really am. Regardless of the motive, this was a dreadful, dreadful act. It's not our place to commentate on the mental state or otherwise of the alleged murderer. What we do know is that in the case of Joe Cox that you mentioned, the last member of Parliament to be equally foully murdered for no reason. You can only say for no reason whatever. A very different profile, equally impossible to categorize. No, I think this is much more about whether there is a simple answer to getting the balance right between protecting members of Parliament going around and doing their, in my view, their legitimate duty, or denying people access to their own members of Parliament in a way that's deeply, deeply embedded in our understanding of the Constitution.
Well, I've just been out in Camden, and I took 5 selfies, along with a bodyguard, I should say. 5 selfies and a few toots and waves from passers-by, and I'm not even now a member of Parliament. If we develop from this a distant political class that cannot be criticized except in a non-vitriolic, it's the word of the moment, way, if we have a political caste that is sealed off from the people they're supposed to be serving, we'll no longer be a democracy, will we?
I agree entirely with your analysis there. I'm struck by the fact that this sort of random, utterly pointless and absolutely vile act has been seen in Christchurch in New Zealand on innumerable occasions in churches in the United States, particularly churches populated generally by Black Americans. I think there is no rational explanation for any of this. And speaking personally, I wouldn't prefer not to have a policeman guarding my surgery. I still want to be in a position where I see people because they say they want to see me, and to do so on a sensible basis. Clearly, if somebody does look particularly likely to be violent or whatever, then you'd want to perhaps ask whether it was wise to admit them into your surgery. But how you possibly identify such an individual, goodness knows. In this particular case, the alleged murderer apparently booked an appointment with the MP in the usual way and presumably had a qualifying address. Now, that's all I ever wanted from my constituents, regardless of their political affiliations, and that's all you've ever demanded of yours. I know that. We're out there to talk to people, to be available to people. So do I want to see a policeman at every door of a constituency surgery? No, I absolutely don't. And incidentally, if we look at the sort of random nature of these dreadful, dreadful atrocities, that probably just puts a policeman as much at risk as any of the MPs or the MP staff. You mentioned Nigel Jones. In his case, not only was he desperately close to death, but his agent was actually hacked to death by this madman. I mean, you can't use any other word but utterly mad. I think this is, you said in your introduction that this is something that we don't seem to have learned any lessons about since Nigel Jones, since Joe Cox, since Stephen Timms. I don't think there is an easy lesson to learn, George. I think we're all, those of us who've been involved in this kind of politics understand that we can walk into a crowd, walk through a crowded market. You and I have done it dozens of times.
Now, let me ask you something. You and I are quite well placed to discuss it, but only Peter Hitchens has really been raising it in the national media. Sir David, as we both know, was a holy man. He was a very devout Roman Catholic. His priest turned up with the oils to try and give him the last rites as his life was slipping away, but was refused access by the police on the grounds it was a crime scene. For some of us, receiving the last rites is as essential as receiving the medical attention itself beyond a certain point. Were you surprised at that news?
I was saddened. Not surprised, because this is an emergency situation. As far as we understand it, there was no question of even getting into a hospital. They knew they had to try and do something at the scene. As far as I know, the paramedics who'd arrived and did so pretty quickly were trying their best to save his life. I think it's desperately unfortunate that, that the priest wasn't able to get to David in time, because I know his faith was very important to him. But George, I don't want to cast any blame in situations like this. This is not about blame. These things happen in these desperate crisis situations. I only wish he could have lived. I only wish we could have got him to a hospital somehow, staunched the bleeding, whatever needed to be done. Sadly, it didn't happen.
Southend should now be given city status in memory of Sir David, shouldn't it?
Yeah, why not? Why not? Is it the most deserving case? No, but would this be a great way to remember one of the best, most decent parliamentarians of any party that I ever met in what's now nearly 40 years before you and I first got elected to Parliament? You know, I think it'd be a great thing to do. Why not? Let's do it.
Steven Norris, thanks for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Always a pleasure.